We will proceed as we did in the morning in alphabetical order. So I'll just introduce each of the panelists now and then get going. Our first speaker will be John Bender, who's professor of English and comparative literature at Stanford and former director of the Stanford Humanities Center and author, most recently, of The Culture of Diagram with Marco Marinan and Ends of Enlightenment. And then we will hear from Sophie G., who's associate professor of English at Princeton. She's the author of Making Waste and the Scandal of the Season, and is currently finishing a book entitled Infidelity, The Rise of the Sacrificial Novel. We will then hear from Sarah Tyndall Kareem, who's associate professor of English at UCLA. Her current research focuses on how the metaphors 18th century writers used to talk about reading fiction, in particular the metaphors of entering into a fictional world or following a narrative thread, reflect and afford distinct modes of readerly attachment. Wendy Lee is assistant professor in the English department at NYU, where she teaches 18th century literature and philosophy. She is finishing a book that she says with appropriate laconic quality about the origins of the Bartleby problem. And finally, last but not least, Courtney Weiss-Smith is associate professor of English at Wesleyan, and her recent book, Empiricist Devotions, Science, Religion, and Poetry in Early 18th Century England, won the Cowan Prize. Yay. So, yay. With no further ado, John.
Okay. I had a title, and I'll explain it to you as we go along. It's Foley Effects in the Gothic, Sound in the Castle of Otranto. And this handout's going around. I'll wait. Don't start my 10 minutes yet, Ruth. So a few modern critics have written specifically about sound in the Gothic novel, but very few. But noises were considered strong generic markers of the Gothic in the 18th century itself. Three different periodicals of the time, and I owe these references to Tasha Eccles, who's here, offer profiles of the Gothic, and they insist, as, say, did the Spirit of the Public Journals in 1798, that the Gothic required, and I quote, noises, whispers, and groans, and indeed demanded 70 at least of each. And other profiles add things like whistles, wind, rushes, howls, rain, creaking doors, and clanking change. So the early inclusion of sound as a marker of the Gothic works to confirm my intuition that sounds are less prominent in what we could call standard English novels of the period than in the Gothic. And indeed, for the 19th century, the Lit Labs at Stanford has had a project which seems to show that across the 19th century, novels become less loud and noisy with a decline of words like shriek, cried, screamed, and other such things. Conversely, when I opened Otranto to prepare this talk, I was overwhelmed by the profusion of sonic dimensions in the text's beginnings and thereafter. There are eruptions of sound everywhere, and also marked silences. Now, this encounter brings me to Foley effects, one very prominent kind of sound effect in film. So what are Foley effects? Like virtually every sound in a film you attend other than dialogue, they're laid down on a soundtrack after the shooting of the film. Only dialogue is recorded generally. They're superimposed by the invisible hand of the Foley artist. I'm viewing Walpole here as an unseen sound artist who calls attention to crucial noises. And Walpole's sounds, like those in films, are highly selective and very, very importantly, louder than in real life. Those glasses clinking, the lock latching, the footsteps creaking, they're always louder. There are exceptions, and I'll mention those in a minute. So he simulates a sense of real sonic experience using the unreal device of printed words. Michel Chion says of film, great sound theorist, he says the realist art of cinema has progressed only by straining against its own principle through forceful doses of unrealism. And I would say that Otranto fits this as well. The point being that what we perceive as realism in film is actually very stylized. Indeed, it's a series of simulations. Now, Foley sounds are made with real objects, but disconnected from the real. They're simulations. Foley effects and other sound effects, they achieve realism, but often by employing the not real. A famous instance in the literature on sound in film is snow. Real snow does not sound like snow. You have to use cornstarch. And real silk stockings don't sound like silk stockings. You have to use nylon. And there are countless other examples. I'll mention some of them along the way. The great sound engineer Walter Murch made this observation, and it's been picked up widely in the film criticism. So this kind of realism, like I would say realism in the novel in general, does not equal the real. So Foley effects almost always imply the spectral, therefore, because they come out of nowhere. Chiron, again, has this term, the audio-visual contract. And I think that's very much at work in Otranto. The idea is that when we see a film, if we just saw the image or we just heard the soundtrack, it would be ineffective. There's an audio-visual contract in which we witness them together, and they have this magical, realistic, generally realistic character. So there's a synergistic co-presence of image and sound. So what are the traits of Foley effects? They're actual sounds on soundtracks like locks, boards, floorboards, clinking glasses, folding sheet metal. So sometimes they're actual sounds of things that may appear in the film. They're almost always louder than they would be in real life. Now, silence in real life never is truly silent. You hear that in the background here. So if you were making a film of this room, your Foley artist would record that sound and lay it on the track as the sound of this room. Foley puts all of those kinds of sounds on film, street noise, the noises of a hotel, doors closing, people talking, TVs on, and so forth. But still, the differentiation between silence and sound effects is very important in film, and a very famous example is this extremely short total silence in Godfather 2 at the end when Michael is sitting by the lake having had his brother murdered. And the sound slowly goes down to absolute silence. Novels can give us absolute silence, and Otranto does that. And this may be the moment to mention Robert Bresson's assertion that with sound coming into film, silence in film became possible. Now, silent films weren't really silent. I mean, there was orchestras and all sorts of things, but you can't have one without the other. You can't have sound effects, silence without sound effects. Now, sound effects in film in general are aimed at the audience, but there are exceptions in sound effects that render psycho effects of a character, very common in horror films, and we see that, I'll show you in a minute, in Otranto with Isabella down in the subterranean corridor. So having told you something about Foley, I'm going to show you the making of Foley for a short film sequence, police chase. On your left will be the film, and on the right will be the Foley artists. And notice that sometimes they're doing what's happening, and sometimes they're doing something completely different. It just will be 2 minutes. You're on, Michelle.
Foley is the process of creating sound effects live in the studio along to a pre-recorded piece of video. Foley Artist uses a variety of props to create or replace sounds that could not properly be captured on set. Here, we see two Hollywood Foley artists bringing an action sequence to life.
I think we can stop there. You're missing the part where the thief punches the cop. And this is an example of a different sound creating the real, because what the Foley artists punch is a leg of lamb. Real punches don't make much sound, apparently. And so you have to punch something else to make the sound. So what we have here sometimes is they're doing what the character in the film is doing. Other times they're making some kind of artful substitute. And so they're producing a realism by a high artificiality that substitutes alternatives very often for normal sounds that we would hear. Now let's look quickly at the handout. I'll just point out a couple of things. There are more highlighted things than I can cover, I believe. But the first is the famous rustling sound of the proportionable quantity of plumes on the fatal helmet. This seems to me a perfect example of the audiovisual contract. You have the plumes moving. Okay, without the rustling sound, without that Foley effect, it would not be the vivid thing that it is. And then the pictures sighing. In some Gothic novels, pictures sigh and then step out of the frame, which would be even better. And then once here, the second part, the lower part of the castle, I'm sure you're all familiar with this flight of Isabel into the lower chambers of the castle. And there's an awful silence there. Now that's a total novelistic silence. That's not the silence of this room or a Foley silence. The novel can give that to us. But then blasts of wind shake the doors as she passed. Rusty hinges creak. They're re-echoed down the labyrinth, so you can imagine how these Foley artists would create that echo. But then something happens. Every murmur struck her with new terror, and the sounds move inside into phantasms and imaginations of her head. On a film, those would still be rendered. You know, but we would intuit through the audiovisual contract that we were now fusing the sounds with her mind rather than with some external object like a door hinge. Then we get the gust of wind, the lamp, total darkness. If you, I think, turn over, this is where Theodore appears. And the moonshine that Jonathan mentioned earlier, coming down and striking the trapdoor that they're looking for. She touches it, the spring clicks, goes down in total darkness. Now, total darkness is also very hard to achieve in the real world, but you can have it in the novel. It's very hard to achieve on film, actually, because then the image goes away and we just have a blank screen. So then she goes down through the trap door, and I'll just close the discussion of the handout with this. Shut the trap door after you, she says. He let the door slip out of his hands. It fell, and the spring closed over it. The noise, and now it becomes diegetic again. The noise of the falling door had been heard by Manfred. So now we take off, and Manfred cries out. Okay, so this is basically my intuition that there's a kind of special sound in Otranto that produces realism through the unreal. And I just note a few other places in the Gothic novel where I think we could discuss this if we weren't doing the conference equivalent of speed dating. Various sequences in Udolpho where Valancourt is playing the lute. Tasha gave me that one. The odd lack of sound at the end of The Monk. When I was working on this, I thought, oh, the end of The Monk will be very noisy, but it's not. Very interesting. Throne voices in Wieland and Confessions of a Justified Sinner. Rochester's mysterious cry to Jane in Jane Eyre. The wind in Wuthering Heights. And lots of sounds in Edgar Allan Poe. So it's just a kind of informal intuition about the novel. I had a lot of fun reading these great film theorists. I have one of Michel Chion's books here, and Walter Murch is only on the web, but he's absolutely fantastic. He did the sound for the Godfather films and many other truly memorable films. So that's it.
Thank you. John, you've got me thinking about a lot of different things, but including what would be the speed dating version of a conference? Maybe marriage? I don't know.
Maybe divorce, you all leave.
Yeah. Okay, so I want to talk for my 10 minutes about authority, about inwardness, and about how the two states coexist, with some passing references to the Castle of Otranto. And I'm going to present this as a list with some detailed points. And I'm into lists at the moment because they don't require an argument. So you can do what you like with them. Okay, so point one. So this is a very odd book which relapses from time to time into other kinds of oddity, the sort of quote-unquote realistic spaces that we would associate with 18th century places like the nursery, the boarding school, the men's club. I think that these sites are sort of kicking around unacknowledged in the Castle of Otranto in these moments where the dialogue really could go in either direction. It could belong in a realist novel, or it could be, well, it should belong in a realist novel, but instead it's in a Gothic novel. And I've chosen those sites advisedly, so I'll tell you why in a minute. What we see in Otranto is that that no space is beyond the reach of authority. And the fact that there's this constant crossover between the Gothic and the real in Otranto invites us to notice how both modes involve acts of what I'm calling overreaching authority. So where some kind of coercion involves a kind of infiltration into minds, into bedrooms, into bodies. These things take place in novels of all kinds, despite the ways in which novels stake out a very strong spatial discipline or boundary creation for themselves. We've talked about doors and things, but just the big spaces of novels, country houses, the picaresque mode, the castle, the grotto, the vault. These are all places where we might think that authority might be able to be contained rather than continue to overreach. But novels are places where everything can reach into everything else, often ludicrously. And really the only place I can think of in Otranto where overreaching or reaching is not as successful, is not achieved, is when Theodore can't reopen the trapdoor and reach into the tunnel or whatever it is. So that's point one. Point two is that there is a group of contemporary thinkers, like people now, who are interested in revisiting the status of faith and belief as a post-Christian or new humanist form of understanding. These people are trying to think about the validity of convictions, of a certain type of conviction, that is obligatory, involuntary, and which is oriented toward idealization and abstraction rather than toward empiricism or materiality. So the key terms here are a type of understanding that is conferred upon the individual as an obligation and which reaches toward an idealization or an abstraction, takes us out of the empirical. So these thinkers are arguing for a renewed attention actually to a form of overreaching. The reaching of obligation into places that have scrupulously been freed from the politics of obligation, like minds and feelings. This is supposed to be what happens in the 18th century. Turns out it doesn't work. People are revisiting this. The question that's prevailing in a certain strain of modern contemporary philosophy is whether it's possible to perform an action or hold a position without choice but still be free. So in other words, there is a return to pre-secular ideas about belief and behaviour, about the idea that beliefs and behaviours can be made obligatory, which in the early modern period would have been constructed by inflexible, among other things, by inflexible religious forms of belief. And this type of obligation has been called obedience, and obedience is pretty out of fashion. So the theoretical move among this group of post-Christian new humanist scholars is to reconstitute obedience, but to lose the belief and behaviour part of it. So to think of a form of obligation that might be freeing because it doesn't produce prescriptions around belief or action. So it's quite subtle, really. The religious anthropologist Tal al-Assad has summarised what I've just said as the notion that formality is necessarily an external form of coercion is questionable. In other words, he's asking whether it's possible to enter a system of meaning without choice and yet not be unacceptably constrained by it. Okay, so my third point, which, as advertised is not precisely related to one or two, is that we think of the 18th century as the moment in which critique emerges as a way of thinking. So, quick revision of what critique is. It's an attempt to problematize or trouble obligation, specifically the kind of obligation that is involved in the production of facts and other fixed or immovable truths. So facts command acquiescence, not only to what they inform us of, but of how they do the informing. We have to submit to that. Critique reinstalls a care for personal interiority and inwardness in an effort to override the rise of the modern state. I get that that's a super duper summary, but let's just go with it for now. Critique sort of has a preference for what in a different political moment we might call the soft truth. And what I mean by that is knowledge that must be produced counterintuitively, that depends upon logic, that infiltrates the box or the trapdoor of a fact and reveals it to be a kind of fiction. And, you know, a few years ago, Bruno Latour got very worried about that and gave a critique of critique in which he said that it was time to, or maybe it was time to restore real facts and to defend them against the charge that they are fake facts or liberal conspiracies. In other words, that the left was now being obligated to do what it had previously had to move so decisively away from, namely to restore the fact as a primary epistemological unit. Okay, so that's 3. Point 4. The Walpole that I work with is the wrong Walpole. I work with the unfashionable one, Robert, who obviously was Horace's father. And it's interesting to me that Horace is the third son. That seems relevant somehow. Anyway, Walpole's administration, again, this is a massive summary, but it really was invested in facts, and it was invested in the fictional machinery of statehood that was required to generate facts. Walpole and the Whigs of the earlier 18th century their commitment to liberty produced a model of statehood in which participation became entirely involuntary. So one of the chief spokespeople for Robert Walpole's model of statehood, a kind of hygienic, very efficient secular state that was separate from the church but had a national church, was a guy called Benjamin Hoadley, who some people might have heard of, some people won't have. He delivered a very contentious sermon at a particular moment during Walpole's actually, it was before Walpole became Prime Minister. It was in 1717, but he continued on into Walpole's period and became his sort of propagandist. Anyway, Hoadley said that an Act of Parliament should not reach to the inward disposition. And he used this claim as the basis for designing a kind of contemporary theology that pushed belief, pushed religion, pushed abstraction and idealisation to the margins of the social world and instated what we think of as the modern state. And what I want to do really quickly is read a passage from the sermon that Hoadley gave in which he laid this out. And what I want you to notice about the passage is its Gothic elaboration. It's extremely overwrought. It relies on a kind of theological hysteria, though without sound effects. And what I want us to think about here is this idea that the production of an un-Gothic state, of a state of material realities contaminated by their overreaching into other closed systems, that the production of that also produces a kind of Gothic register. So here's the passage. If any man upon earth have a right to add to the sanction of his laws, that is to increase the number or alter the nature of the rewards and punishments of his subjects in matters of conscience or salvation, they are so far kings in his stead and reign in their own kingdom, him here being Christ, and not in his. So it is whenever they erect tribunals and exercise a judgment over the consciences of men and assume themselves to the determination of such points as cannot be determined but by one who knows the hearts, or when they make any of their own declarations or decisions to concern and affect the state of Christ's subjects with regard to the favour of God, this is so far the taking of Christ's kingdom out of his hands and placing it into their own. So I'm going to end by reflecting that it took an enormous amount, rhetorically speaking, cognitively, and in terms of, it took a lot, to segregate conscience and action, to separate the world of the fact from the world of the idealization or abstraction. And a lot of that work was done during Walpole's period in office, and that I think that Otranto is considering some of the implications of that that segregation. Yeah.
All right, I'm really happy to be here. I wanted to thank Jonathan and Nicole and everyone else for being here. Really enjoyed hearing all the panelists and seeing lots of connections between the observations we've been making. What I'm going to be talking about today relates in a roundabout kind of way to the book projects I'm working on in the moment. And I wanted to begin by situating a little bit and explaining that the second book project in its current iteration emerged from a crisis I had about 2 or 3 months ago, where I was just sort of pathologically procrastinating and found that I did not want to write the book that I had designed for myself to write, which was titled Suspended World, and it was meant to be about these kinds of metaphors of delicate enclosures like bubbles and other types of spaces, and thinking about how those worked as metaphors for fiction in the period. But I'd become really just fascinated by Hogarth's account of intricacy and the analysis of beauty, and I kept telling everybody, I just want to write about intricacy, I just want to shelf that whole thing. And then, and this is a very, very kind of LA epiphany story, I was driving along Sunset Boulevard, and if you've ever driven along Sunset, it's an extremely winding road full of these sort of hairpin bends, and I suddenly decided that no, this was a book about 2 different figures. And so I retitled it, I actually pulled off Sunset to write this down. And I decided it was going to be called The Thread and the Shell, Forms of Attachment in 18th Century Literature, and that it was going to be about these 2 paradigms or gestalts for the way in which people, readers in the 18th century, are being invited to read, one of which is a model of pursuit and following a thread, and the other one is of entering this kind of delicate enclosure, and that's the shell. So in the course of bringing these 2 ideas together, I've become really fascinated with Daedalus, for reasons partly to do with the nature of his inventions and his interest in both threads and shells. So if this paper had a title, it would be called Daedalian Otranto, except that I don't really know how to pronounce the word Daedalian, so I won't call it that, but that's what it would be if it had a title. Okay, so the adjective Daedalian, which I only discovered maybe a month ago, means of or in the style of Daedalus, skillful, ingenious, formed with art, resembling the labyrinth of Daedalus that he designed at Crete that housed the Minotaur, intricate and maze-like. So specifically, my interest in it is as a kind of synonym for intricate. But it's also, and this picks up on Sophie, what Sophie was talking about, it's a term that Bruno Latour uses and turns into a noun. So for Latour, a Daedalian is a technical mediation that creates detours. And I think this actually also kind of connects to what you were saying about the question of whether something can be constraining or whether but you can also be free at the same time. So a Daedalian constrains behavior, but not in a way that's deterministic, but that rather sort of pushes you in certain directions. And his main example, this is in Pandora's Hope, his main example of a Daedalian is a speed bump. But in that the same chapter where he discusses the Daedalian, the speed bump as a Daedalian, he also says that fiction is a Daedalian. Fictions are also detours that we can make, as he says, without leaving our seats. So with this concept in mind, I decided that Walpole strikes me as a Daedalian writer, someone who like Daedalus himself, most famously in his labyrinth, shapes matter in a way that creates detours. Walpole's letters, and I'm going to be citing bits of text that have already come up fascinatingly today. Walpole's letters refer to both reading and writing as a matter of imaginatively moving bodies in space, moving or stilling, I should say, bodies in space. So when he's contemplating adding a bower to Strawberry Hill, he wonders if he, and this is a quotation, must go and read Spenser and wade through his allegories and drawling stanzas to get at a picture, end quote. And we kind of have this sense in that moment that he really wants a snapshot. He wants a picture of romance, of a bower. He doesn't want a peregrination or to have to pursue something, but Spenser demands pursuit and kind of reading as a detour. Then on other occasions, the activity of spooling out narrative just lurches to a stop very suddenly. When he's writing Otranto, he recalls, and this is the part of the passage that Cindy quoted earlier, I was so engrossed with my tale that one evening I wrote from the time I had drunk my tea, about 6 o'clock till half an hour after 1 in the morning, when my hand and fingers were so weary that I could not hold the pen to finish the sentence, but left Matilda and Isabella talking in the middle of a paragraph. So there, I think, we have both of those situations in mind, the wading through Spenser to get at a picture and the kind of writing in a kind of rush and then leaving Matilda and Isabella marooned mid-paragraph. I think Walpole shapes space in such a way as to produce these kinds of situations in Otranto, in the novel itself. He shapes space in such a way that enclosures turn into passages and passages turn into enclosures in which tableaus move and moving bodies stop in their tracks. And I think in staging these shifts between stillness and motion, he's reflecting on the relationship between two modes of representation. And this is where I'm getting to the kind of thread and shell idea, that in which a frame encloses content and that in which content unfolds progressively in a way that needs to be pursued or followed. So the famous moment in which the portrait of Manfred's grandfather quits its panel is only the most striking of several instances in which a frame becomes a threshold. And this is itself, as I've discovered recently through reading endlessly about Daedalus, a kind of Daedalian spectacle. So Daedalian, I should just decide how I'm going to pronounce that word. Daedalian sculpture is sculpture that is supposedly so lifelike that Daedalus was said to produce statues that walked or that moved. And Aristophanes has a lost play that supposedly turns on a statue of Daedalus's that walks, that moves. The moment in which the portrait quits its panel foreshadows one that follows in quick succession, another one that's been alluded to several times today, in which Theodore, supposed to be confined under the fatal helmet, escapes from the helmet into the vault below. When Manfred finds him, he discovers, and this is another quotation, that one of the cheeks of the enchanted cask had forced its way through the pavement of the court, as his servants had let it fall over the peasant, and had broken through into the vault, leaving a gap through which the peasant had pressed himself. And I'm going to come back a little bit to that language just in a minute. But just to say, in Otranto, every time Providence opens a gap in the roof, it also slams shut a trapdoor. Isabel urges Theodore to shut the trapdoor after he exits, but as we've just heard, it slams shut up before he has the chance, thereby, as John was saying, signaling his presence to Manfred. What noise was that, said Manfred, which I heard as I entered the cloister. A door collapsed, said the peasant. I heard it as well as you. Moments like these turn passages into enclosures and enclosures into passages in ways, and I guess this is my gambit or claim here, that seem to assert the agency of the frame itself. It is the helmet, not Theodore, that forces its way through the floor in that passage I read before with the cheeks breaking down into the floor below. It's the door that claps, not Theodore who shuts it. And I wonder if we might see these moments, and this is speculative, as ones in which the border exerts its own agency as textual incarnations of the arabesque, that movement in which decorative and ornamental forms associated with borders and frames, that movement associated with those kinds of frames, and also often comprising of leaf work and shell work. So then this is my final point, but I'm going to try to extemporize a little bit in explaining what I mean. I think that Otranto's merging of frame and inframed, passage and enclosure, draws our attention then to these two different metaphors I want to suggest by which we understand representations. On the one hand, it's a pursuit. Manfred, and this is another quotation, is impatient to unravel this clue. And again, this is something I didn't know until recently, but that probably many of you know, that the word clue comes from the ball of thread that you use to navigate a labyrinth. And so Walpole is using that quite literally there, the idea of unraveling a clue. But at the same time, and I think Gina was talking about this, he's also transfixed by the helmet, and that's like another model of kind of suspense and being transfixed. And, you know, I think likewise in the way Otranto works as a novel, you know, it's clearly, and Walpole alludes to this in his preface, it's trying to kind of produce this kind of suspense and tension in the reader that we might associate more with this pursuit model. But it's also, and I think it was, again, Cindy who reminded me of this, you know, he characterizes the way he comes up with the novel as deriving from, or he says that his head is filled with Gothic story, that it's like that we're kind of traveling into that space of the head filled with Gothic story in a way that sort of suggests more of a sort of static image that we can enter, a kind of living picture. So I think that there's a way in which the novel is drawing our attention to what we might call kind of shell work on the one hand and thread work in the other, and the ways in which these are two paradigms, but in a way that's really, I don't know exactly how to describe it, but just like vexing. And I'll just end by saying that the word unravel is, I've become completely obsessed with the word unravel. An unraveled mystery is both a solved mystery and an unsolved one, because the word unravel means both the opposite of the verb ravel and the opposite and unravel. Yeah, I'm going to get it wrong. It's just like makes my head hurt so much to think about it. But in essence, it's a solved mystery and an unsolved mystery. And I think that what Walpole is doing here is something like sort of confronting us with the limits of these different modes, hermeneutic modes or modes of interpretation, and kind of like just like letting us butt up against them and making our brain hurt by having them constantly kind of shift modes and shift into another just all the time and constantly. So I will leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Nicole and Yale. I feel like the standard here for me is a substitute teacher because I'm a fill-in for Michael Gamer, okay? So just bear that in mind. So I don't write about Walpole or Otranto, and I'll just do the best I can. And I was saying to Gina, I feel like this is the gay version of her talk. So keep that in mind. Okay, so rereading The Castle of Otranto, I felt like most texts, this is one that is probably best experienced as a drag show. And I mean like all queens kind of drag show. And I'm talking about something that I guess for Walpoleans is so obvious that you maybe didn't want to talk about it today, which is camp. That's a sort of a special Walpolean sensibility. And I thought for this group, including Sarah, but I think also Sean and Jesse and others, we could apply camp as a test for the experience of wonder. And so my question would be whether camp and campy pleasure is antithetical to wonder. Whether camp is too knowing, too surface, too made. Now, I think Sarah has already provided an answer to this in her book, which is to say, no, it's not antithetical. In novels, she makes this gorgeous distinction to wonder at and to wonder about an object. So in novel reading, you have this double experience of recognition and estrangement, enchantment and disenchantment, suspense and admiration, what she beautifully calls the verisimilar marvelous. So here's an example of that, I think, in The Castle of Otranto, read by Joseph Roach. Take it away, Joe. Oh, okay, in this scene also, sorry. Okay, let me cue you up. So, of course, Theodore, his shirt he's about to be, like beheaded or so whatever by Manfred, and his, it's kind of like in a tennis match when Rafael Nadal is playing, and after the match he changes his sweaty shirt, and like the whole audience gasps at his abdominals. So it's that kind of moment. His shirt falls and reveals the shoulder and reveals the bloody arrow. Take it away, Professor Roach.
Gracious heaven! Cried the holy man, starting. What do I see? Is it my child, my Theodore? The passions that ensued must be conceived. They cannot be painted. The fears of the assistants were suspended by wonder rather than stopped by joy. They seemed to inquire in the eyes of their Lord what they ought to feel. Surprise, doubt, tenderness, respect succeeded each other in the countenance of the youth. He received with modest submission the effusion of the old man's tears and embraces, yet afraid of giving a loose to hope and suspecting from what had passed, the inflexibility of Manfred's temper, he cast a glance towards the prince, as if to say, "Canst thou be unmoved at such a scene as this?"
Thank you. Okay, so you see the two experiences there. First, that suspension of wonder. So itself is a kind of suspension of feeling, and then the servants have to say, okay, what am I supposed to feel here? Am I supposed to feel? They're looking to see what to slot into that emptiness. And then that great moment where Theodore is like, are you taking this in? Are you seeing how moving this is? Okay, so to go back to camp. So in the Sontag essay, here are a few definitions of camp. Camp is a logic of taste. It's a way of looking. It's self-parody plus self-love. It's a tender feeling. And here's Joseph Roach last year, or a year before, at ASEX on Horace Walpole on camp. So in Roach's statement, if kitsch, in Milan Kundera's formulation, is the complete absence of shit, think Cinderella's castle at Magic Mountain, then camp, by contrast, means kitsch with all the shit self-consciously and artfully restored. Okay. So number 56 in Sontag's essay, camp taste is a kind of love for human nature. In other words, it doesn't judge. So, is The Castle of Otranto, is the novel a vehicle to accommodate and exonerate male feeling? Especially as, and Joe's reading fleshes this out, especially the primary ambivalence towards women. In other words, the Harvey Weinstein story every time. That is to say, men's constitutional incapacity to regulate their passions and women's collective endurance of their inevitable victimization. Roach writes that camp isn't about escape, but relief. That it isn't transgression, but expansion. And here are some great formulations. That camp is an earnest insincerity. That it's an exclamation point disguised by a question mark. Camp reveals no hidden depths, he writes, because what is hiding in plain sight needs all the therapeutic recuperation it can get. So rereading it now in this moment, I thought, well, what camp knows is that the story of heterosexuality is a really sad one. And as Sandra McPherson in person and in her scrupulous scholarship reminds me, it's a story in which men are confused and women get hurt or destroyed all the time. Camp allows us to see that story for everything it's worth. You get to feel sorry for it, the whole catastrophe we're tending towards, in Walpole's language. You get to feel sorry for it, feel sorry for ourselves, our loved ones, and our enemies. But also like, we get it. Here's Roach again. Camp stages what is too important to be taken seriously. And I would adjust to what is too true to be taken seriously. Here's where I think that camp may be incompatible with wonder. And I rely here on Spinoza's description of wonder, which is when you behold an object that for you has no precedence in quality or degree. And so it absorbs all of your attention because you have no chain of associations that it launches, no field of reference in beholding that object. And this is Spinoza. Wonder is the conception of anything wherein the mind comes to a stand, because the particular concept in question has no connection with other concepts. In Otranto and in camp, we see the aggressively unavoidable precedence of the story, its dogged, tragic, and hilarious persistence. So Harvey Weinstein or Hamlet or Henry VIII, but also, thank God, the saucy herald, the unhappy princesses, the unknown mutes, the handsome cavalier, the buried and mangled and bleeding and disfigured and dashed to pieces, already puny, unathletic body of Conrad. My hunch is that camp is a way to avoid contempt. And this is, for Spinoza, the opposite feeling of wonder. Contempt is the conception of anything which touches the mind so little that its presence leads the mind to imagine those qualities which are not in it rather than such as are in it. An example of contempt here, like last week I went to a very straight, very white millennial wedding. And it's, you know, it's soul-destroying experience. It's like you think, is he really going to kiss the bride? Are they really going to feed each other cake? Is there really going to be a first dance? And they do all of it. And it would be horrible, except that, you know, a few days before, I had gone at NYU to the Halloween drag queen Cinderella big extravagant performance, and there's some way in which drag redeems the rituals of heterosexuality. So you get to, in camp, you get to eat the cake you're stuck with, no matter that it's made of shit and guaranteed to make you sick and will probably kill you. But here's a better version of that metaphor. You don't have to ingest the cake yourself, but you do get to cheer on all the queens while they're eating it. And not just eating it, but ripping off each other's tiaras over it, stuffing it in each other's bra cups and jock straps, wrapping the goopy pieces of it in glittered wax paper and tinsellated ribbon, and then firing all of those packages out of a unicorn rainbow poo-shooting cannon so that it pours over the whole fiesta like confetti at a Donna Summer concert. That was the gay version of Gina's thing. That's all. That's it.
I find that pretty hard to follow.
Best substitute teacher
Yeah.
Thanks, Jonathan and Nicole, for today. Such fun. I, too, am going to talk about the sounds of Otranto. So as John beautifully showed us, there's lots to say about the novel's inarticulate sounds, which anticipate a now familiar Gothic soundscape of the disembodied, indefinite, eerie. For example, a passage John cited, an awful silence reigned throughout those subterranean regions, except now and then some blast of wind that shook the door Isabella had passed, and which, grating on the rusting hinges, were re-echoed through that long labyrinth of darkness. Every murmur struck her with a new terror. Isabella van Elfren's book, Gothic Music, The Sounds of the Uncanny, cites this passage as it summarized the Gothic conventions that Otranto helped shape. Quote, "The advent of terror is generally preceded by an unworldly silence, aided by meteorological, wind, thunder, rain, or technical, rattling fences, hissing pipes, circumstances, and announced by sounds that suggest presence, creaks, echoes, voices, music." Indeed, Van Elfren treats echo as the perfect figure for what she calls the im/materiality of Gothic sound. An echo, quote, "suggests physical presence, but it is disconnected from it like a phantom doppelganger of its former self," end quote. My new project is an intellectual history of the sound of words, and of poetic sound in particular. So I want to talk today in a rather speculative way about the novel's articulate sounds, the way the sounds link with semantics. If Walpole's re-echoing participates in a Gothic tradition of disembodied sounds that tantalizingly suggest but refuse to confirm some other presence, his various ways of highlighting articulate sounds might suggest a different understanding, as themselves present and embodied. Fascinating work by actually many people in this room has underscored the importance of the novel's things. I'm asking if the novel sketches, too, the possibility that words are a kind of thing. So, approached as many 18th century writers approach them, echoes are a useful figure for this understanding, too. I have to admit that I've been thinking way too much recently about Pope's "the sound must seem an echo to the sense," and then echoes in particular. Walpole did some thinking about echoes, too. Post-Otranto, he wrote a silly one-act performance piece featuring the early modern tradition of echo verse. In this tradition, words are compounded material things moving through space and time. Words bounce around, disaggregate, and their parts change meaning. So in a traditional echo verse, a speaker asks, "Tell me, what is that supreme delight?" And the echo answers, "Light." So delight, light comes apart. In Walpole's version, a hilarious version actually, a fairy punishes a man with the loss of some part of himself, but he gets to choose which part. He must communicate his choice to echo. The man chooses an expendable part, his tears, but the echo catches only ears. "I did not say my ears," the man insists, but the echo hears only confirmation, ears. Desperate, the man tries to break the word into parts, "my tears," but of course the echo catches only ears. Like other echo verse, Walpole's Jeu d'Esprit treats sounds as the building blocks of sense in a resolutely material way, combining, recombining, drifting, moving. Echoing sounds need not be thought of as immaterial phantom doppelgangers of lost presence. They are themselves present nuggets of meaning moving through space and time. Walpole's novel seems literally to begin with something like the echo verse disaggregation of EARS. For the title page gives the real Italian writers' names as Onufrio Miralto. As Sir Walter Scott has suggested, this name is a sort of anagram of Horatio Walpole. 4 letters are missing and some new ones are added. Scott also calls it a kind of translation, and after him, some fantastic theories have been floated. Wall goes French, M-U-R, a Pole can be alto, Italian for high, and so on. Letters and sounds pull apart, drift, recombine. They signify and obscure. Otranto features other sound play in the spirit of echo verse as well. When Matilda faints after overhearing Manfred sentence Theodore to death, Bianca shrieks, "Help, help, the princess is dead." Bianca's words move. Manfred hears them and stops what he is doing to figure out what happened. We later find out that the words traveled yet further, and as they moved, their meaning shifted. A monk visiting the castle heard the scream and then brought word to the convent that another princess, Hippolyta, was dead. Sounds are wayward things. They carry meaning, but not always reliably. If here, the sounds retain their proper shapes as words, unlike Tear's ears, Walpole also allowed sound shapes to morph in their movements, thus his comic malapropism. When the servant Jacques, who Manfred calls a blockhead, is reporting the supernatural sight his friend saw while they were supposed to be looking for Isabella, he says, quote, "We were comprehensive we might meet a ghost." He means apprehensive, and there's a playful irony in the fact that because they were apprehensive, they were totally failing to be comprehensive in their search. The idea, I think, is that Jacques has heard apprehensive before. He held on to the word and now tries to work with it, but he isn't in control of the sound and the sense both. There's an extra materially charged irony here in that there is an etymological link between the two words, the Latin prehendere, to grasp, which is exactly what Jacques feels at doing. Words move, and their physical parts and meanings can shift in the traveling, grasping, and reusing. Of course, like echo verse and anagram, both the overheard phrase and the clownish malapropism have long literary histories, but the fact that the conventions are borrowed doesn't undercut the way of thinking sound that they offer. If the sounds of words are wayward materials, the punning on prehendere suggests that they are also historical materials. Walpole often uses obsolete or archaic forms of English words. The Broadview edition flags disculpate, halidame, wanat, and corse for corpse, as well as a whole host of terms describing armor and architecture. Such terms, like the historical objects that some of them reference, persist from the past, and especially with the archaic spellings, it's particularly their corporeal shape as words that persist. There are other ways, too, that the novel's words get aligned with its historical things. Theodore's body is marked, as Joe and Wendy just nicely reminded us. His facial features have an exact resemblance to his ancestor Alfonso, and his back bears the mark of the bloody arrow. But his name, too, is a thing that contains this secret. As scholars have noted, Theodore comes from the Greek words theos and dora. It means God-given. "My name is Theodore," he says climactically just before his father recognizes him. And in the end, Theodore is both good, rightful heir to Otranto, given Otranto by supernatural forces. Of course, the etymological secret is made the more complicated by the editor's proposal that the names of the novel are fictitious, probably disguised on purpose. But whether we think the name comes from Jerome and his wife, or from an artful medieval writer, or from Walpole himself, Theodore is the product of a prior act of naming that marks his prior right to Otranto. Certainly, we can't put this pressure on all of the names, but in all of his sound play, including the eerie echoes that interest Van Elfren in her account of Gothic sound, Walpole throws out possibilities without fully developing them. In some intriguing ways, halidame, wanat, Theodore, Walpole's words are like echoes, sounds that move meaningfully, if unpredictably, through space and time. Since I've been working here alongside but against the grain of Van Elfren's account, I'll close as she does. She notes that for all its talk of sounds, the page of the Gothic novel is itself mute. Grace Poole's laughter in Jane Eyre is all the more frightening because it is doubly removed from its alleged origin. First, through its ghostly disembodiment, and second, because the reader does not actually hear it. For Van Elfren, the mute page makes Gothic sounds doubly immaterial and uncanny. This is not, I think, how Walpole's various plays with the sounds of words work. If anything, repeated phrases, malapropisms, and etymologies heighten our sense of the physical qualities of words in our ears and on the page. The sound plays thus seem related to other found texts in the novel, the couplet written on the unearthed saber blade, the ancient prophecy difficult to make any sense of, which is said to have pronounced, "That word interests me," the downfall of the present family. And of course, Walpole first presented his novel itself as a found object. Like the sounds it features, the novel itself is a material, historical, wayward thing. This brings me to a final question or puzzle. I've long been struck by the way the sound of the novel changes at the end. Throughout, Walpole favors alliterative pairs, impious intentions, reason to rejoice. They're everywhere. But then Manfred stabs Matilda, and suddenly we get these intense patches of alliteration that feel to me like a departure from the earlier prose. You'll just have to listen here. "Murderous monster," cried Manfred. "Heaven directed my bloody hand to the heart of my child. The earth rocked, and the clank of more than mortal armor was heard behind. Our doom is pronounced. Shall we not, can we not, but dedicate the few deplorable hours we have to live in deprecating the farther wrath of heaven?" You should have these written out so I don't have to, okay. I truly don't know what to make of these. The alliteration amps up right as the drama reaches its crisis, so we might think of something like what Garrett Stewart sees as carefully knotted linguistic and psychological threads in Jane Eyre. But murderous monster and Manfred come from different voices, and I'm not sure that there's any necessary relation between alliteration and emotion. In fact, one might think that in moments of intensity, the mediating material of text might seem to fall away. There is an onomatopoeia in the clank of supernatural armor, but this isn't consistent either, for how do breathy H's fit stabbing, or the drumbeat of D's a pious resolution? I haven't quite figured out the logic of this, but I'm tempted to think about these alliterative births in relationship to the echo-verse disaggregation of T-E-A-R-S, or the anagrammatic play of Muralto. Relevant, too, is the argument recurrent in prosody after Milton that there is something distinctively Gothic about rhyme, quote, "the invention of a barbarous age," end quote, especially insofar as it involves trivial play with jingling words. Like the castle walls crumbling behind Manfred, words are material and mortal, fallen, fallible, emotion-evoking, and anyway, all we got. When Walpole uses alliteration to emphasize the letters of his words at the novel's end, might he again be embracing the fact that words are made of sounds, embodied material phenomena that combine, disaggregate, recombine, persist, echoing one another? Thanks.
Open it to questions.
I have questions for the two papers on sound, and John is going first. I mean, I love the analogy to film, but I'm wondering why you need film when in the 18th century there is such a pronounced and interesting tradition of achieving stage effects by unreal sound. So, Garrett talks about how the player who plays Macbeth should wear cork in his shoes so that he can walk across the stage silently during the murder scene. I mean, it seems that many of the things that you're describing seem to be a consequence of the thing that for me is paramount, that this is a translation of a 5-act drama into a novel. And so, Courtney, I'm just going to quickly add that, I mean, I love the concept of echoes, and I mean, you should think about, the notion of character echoes in the Gothic. So when we hear the name Theodore in the monk, that is meant to echo that character of Theodore that we get in the Castle of Otranto, and Matilda is another echoed name. And even within texts like the monk, Ambrosio seems echoed to Antonia, which kind of tells us about the connection as well. So.
Go ahead.
Yeah, that's great. That's super useful. And I like the way then that the character itself is being, like the name is the kind of material metonymy for that, and that it's picked up out of the text. So there's something kind of like portable and trinkety or something about that. I'll have to do more thinking. That's great.
John, do you want to pick up the other part of the question?
Well, I mean, I believe in both and. I wouldn't rule out the things from the 18th century theater, but I do think there's a value added in the sound theorists because of notions like the psychoacoustic contract and the acoustosonic contract, in which you get a multiplication or magnification of the effect by the presentness of both. Now that could happen in the theater as well, but I think also the methodical use of real sounds in the Foley Artists lab to make effects that are either on the one hand like those sounds in film, or the use of completely different objects to make sounds that become real. Probably we could find analogs in theater, but I think it's much more vivid in film theory. I don't see any harm, I guess, and I do see value added. But the historical dimension from the 18th century theater would be great as well. And of course, Walpole was involved in it. And you know, Marshall Brown writes about the effects of the Gothic in plays prior to Walpole. So I don't doubt that it's there. You know.
I just follow up a quick question, which is not Otranto based, but just Foley based, which I didn't know anything about until today. Are those sound dubbers, as it were, are they watching the film as they do this? They're not following a script.
No, they're watching the film.
They're watching.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's visual as they're doing. Cindy. Yeah.
Well, and this speaks to the value added that you just mentioned, John. And I think this could bring you into Courtney, but what your Foley effects made me think of, you said the audiovisual contract applies to everything kind of except dialogue, but Joe's reading made me think in Otranto, perhaps in the Gothic more generally, the dialogue itself is laid on. That's one of the things that Lewis didn't like. He said, how can this be realistic dialogue? And then he quoted some of these lines. Even then they didn't talk like this, did they? So there is a kind of sonic overlay in the text itself, the Foley effect of dialogue.
Yeah, I can see that, yes. I mean, there is sometimes dubbed dialogue in films, but in general, the dialogue will have been recorded on set. But there are many, many instances where sound is dubbed in, most obviously singers in musicals.
Yeah.
Sounds like louder than they're actually talking.
Yes, yeah.
Bender.
I was hoping, Sarah, that you and Sean might be able to talk to one another about the arabesque, because on Sean's account, like ornamentality is a kind of multiplication of, kind of multiplicity or mode of multiplication. Whereas, like for you, this idea of the border exerting its own agency seems different from that account of the arabesque as multiplicity, right? So that was my sense of there being a kind of different logic to each of your accounts of something that on its face might be understood even in the history of aesthetics in our own period as similar. So I'm just throwing that out there.
I mean, the arabesque isn't a term I've thought a huge amount before writing this paper. So I think what was striking to me in the characterizations of it that I was reading was that it was, on the one hand, sort of picking up on that serpentine, the idea of the serpentine was characteristic of the arabesque, but that there were also these, that the term shell work is used. And even Kant doesn't use the term arabesque, but he talks about shell work and describes formations that people think could be described as arabesque. But I definitely think I don't want to make the claim that it's one-dimensional or linear and not complex. Or I mean, the thing I was sort of struck by more was that if you hear me say, well, mine's about thread and then yours is about weaving and complexity, it sounds like I'm setting up a kind of opposition, but I don't want to do that. And I mean, I'm getting the language of the thread and the shell I'm getting from Hogarth, where he, as you know, I'm sure many of you know, he talks about the threads as the shell is made up of a network of threads. You know, so it is a kind of complex, and he's not trying to kind of make it into a binary opposition between two completely distinct forms. So I think there's room for both of those, the emphasis on bordering and on complexity.
But then, you know, the pelvic bones are kind of exemplum of ornamentation or of the arabesque. And there's something about pelvic bones that are, with respect to the human body, the very idea of reduction, say, in your vocabulary, Sean. So you know, the carriage, the underpinned, the sort of irreducible, you know, and the irreducible basis of a form.
Sean, did you want to?
I wasn't ready for the pelvic bone.
No one ever is, Sean.
Where did you pluck the pelvic bones? Where is that from? Something? What's that from?
The analysis. There's the this shape.
Right. I do. I think I understand.
There's a clear way. So this is partly tangential, but there's a clear way in which Hogarth, it's quite clear to me that he's responding to a discourse that emerges in the late 17th century about the wolfiness of things, and that turns up in its own way when he starts thinking seriously about what it means to do engraving. And he stumbles over the question of the fact that engraving looks unfortunately like texture. Mm-hmm. But he also wants to get to a sense of how is it that lines, individual lines, add up to surface. Mm-hmm. Right? And that's one of the ways that late 18th century philosophy comes to the notion of emergent properties, how you can take individual lines and add them up to surface. Mm. So that's what I see as being as it were the route from thread to shell in Hogarth as he's working it out. Yeah. There's a different dimension that has to do with it, specifically the serpentine, that has to do with returning to embodied movement, because mm-hmm. It's the line that occupies space.
I have a question, but I wanted to say something real quickly on the shell thread conversation. And this is something that Sarah and I have talked about before. But I'm struck in the context of the Gothic and Otranto by the fact that Hogarth, in the moment that he wants to turn the shell into a metaphor for this linear figure made of threads, his phrasing is, he says, like, imagine a shell with its contents scooped out so nicely. And so I've talked to Sarah before about how I find this phrase so gory and evocative, but that he actually has to go through the motions of imagining scooping out the material, organic contents of an actual biological shell, right, that has a creature inside, in order to turn it into a figure of threads and lines. And anyway, so there's a kind of haunting, right? There's this kind of gory haunting of the figure.
And I know you have another question, but it just makes me think that they would have had to scoop out the helmet, presumably, before using it as a prisoner, because otherwise it would have been disgusting. Maybe the disgustingness was part of it.
Oh, I see. Because it had Conrad.
So it always remains with it, right?
Right, yeah. But my question, I actually had a question inspired by Courtney's discussion of echoes, and I want to bring Courtney's and Wendy's papers together. I'm going to try. So I don't know if you've already thought about this, but when you were doing your reading of echoes, and particularly the echo verse, where the echo is this reiteration with a very minor formal distortion that has an enormous consequence in terms of the meaning, right, or the significance of the utterance. It seemed to describe so perfectly the epigraph to the Castle of Otranto, the little passage from Horace that I think Sean made reference to in his paper this morning, but where he misquotes Horace from the Ars Poetica. And it's a very, very minor tweak, right? Like he alters the language in this really minor way, but completely reverses the meaning. So the Ars Poetica kind of says, in the grotesque or the ridiculous, the head and the foot cannot be reconciled to, there's strange fantasies where the head and the foot cannot be reconciled to a single form. And the epigraph to Otranto says, strange fantasies in which the head and the foot are nevertheless reconciled to a single form. And this reminded me of Wendy's Wendy's claim that I completely agree with, that there's something about camp that redeems like heterosexual forms. There's something about that echo and the distortion it performs that somehow, like that nevertheless gives a form or restores to a form. It's like camp is an echo, right, of this like horrible original that distorts it in such a way that it actually provides a redeemed form for it, right? Like it gives it like a form of, like a redeemed form of, to go forward with something.
I guess by redeem, I meant like not want to kill yourself.
But yeah, that's kind of what I mean too. But camp or parody or whatever it is as a kind of echo in this sense. I guess I'm just wondering if that's, if that's at all a different way of thinking about it, or if echo is just a term I'd not thought about that I'm kind of making describe things like camp, and parody the way we've been describing them for a long time.
I mean, that's great. The only thing that comes to mind is the thing with the partial, because you take off the T, right?
Right.
So, whereas I think camp is like the whole shebang, not the partial.
But I had to have sort of a follow-up question that pertains to it, which was, the alliterative stuff that you were reading at the end there, and your YouTube video. I mean, they're both very camp. And it made me think about Pope's thing about the sound must seem an echo to the sense, which I also have never understood except at the most nominal level. And it made me wonder whether he's talking about the affective and formal life of camp, actually, which sort of explains why the sound must seem an echo to the sense. So I get what you're saying, that it's not partial. It's beyond, but it's like more than, not less than.
Right.
But I would say, like, in Echoverse, that also happens. Like, other ones say, like, what do women most prize when we men address, like, it ends with address. Like, what do, and then what women most prize is A space dress, right? Or even just, like, the ears, and then ears comes back. So, like, I think there is a way, I don't know what you think about this, but I guess I would think that one of the things Echoverse does is just like throw attention onto like the matter that's bringing it to us, right? Or like it brings attention to like the medium in a certain way, which like your reading did exactly as well. Just kind of like bring attention to like the rawness of the words, right? This is like half thought, but I was thinking, Sophie, actually of your paper and the like tension, the contrast between like belief and action, right? Like maybe there's a way in which by just throwing attention onto like the bodily, onto the medium, onto like the corporeal side, it just sort of like undercuts like earnest belief, like true spiritual, it's not like they really think in those sort of overwrought terms, but there's a kind of awareness that deflates a little bit.
So John, is this really different than a Foley effect? Because on the one hand, a Foley effect, more real than real, but it's not, it's emphasizing like, the materiality and the key turning or the foot stomping. But to completely mask, I mean, the effect is pure reality. In other words, you're not.
In our perception of it.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. It's not camp. Foley effect is not camp.
Well, not if it's effective. I mean, because then it seems to be part of a kind of natural world of the film.
But in that clip, it is. In the clip,
yes, I was thinking of that too.
There you've got the film making a meta comment on itself. I had a question for you. Could I quickly go back to Jesse's? There was a medium other than theater in the 18th century, which is phantasmagoria, which really comes into its own in the later part of the century. But there were sound effects in that as well. But Wendy, I wonder, maybe I missed something, but do you believe that Otranto was camp in 1764? Or is it only camp later, including now?
I don't know. It seems like it always had to be camp, but I don't know. I mean, I guess camp
A lot of people were scared to death by it. You know, and there's this story about people going out in a boat and reading it by candlelight.
Oh, I guess I was thinking, was it camp for Walpole? What do you think the answer to that is? I mean, this is.
Well, there are parts of it that are clearly supposed to be fun.
Yeah.
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 Not just the screwball stuff in the dialogue, but even the very beginning of the novel. We're talking about
Yeah.
the first novel.
Well, if you go back to Pope's, if you go back to the scriblarian Perry Hoopsos, the art of sinking in poetry, which we were talking about, you know, and I mean, there's, if not camp, certainly a send-up element of the false, sublime, already there in whenever that was written, 1720 or 18 or 21 or something like that, by that group of people. So that notion of a send-up of the serious is certainly already there. And their mock panegyrics and, you know, other mock forms. Tale of a Tub is brimming with them. Is that the same as camp? I'm just not sure. I think.
No, I don't
think
quite.
Macaulay talking about Walpole's taste in antiquaries but maybe also the Castle of Otranto uses the term the odd, which I always thought was a kind of good expression of, you know, maybe that's not quite the camp and it's not quite the novel, but it's something a little off.
It's not snarky, you know. I mean, you say more. I mean, camp is really like it's only doing the Donna Summer thing because it's like weeping all the time. It's like so sad. Camp is really sad, and it's not just choosing not to be sad about it. I don't know.
You said when you said it's the wraparound, it's tears without ears.
Yeah. Or ears with it. I mean, if it's sad, but what did you just say? It's sad without being sad about the sad?
I don't know. Yeah.
Then it would be more like ears without tears.
Ears without tears. Yeah. Ears without
You know, it's Sontag. Put it in.
Right.
Put it in a question mark.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Mark with a question mark that's, as I say, disguised, or an exclamation point disguised as a question.
But if you jump off from Sontag, then, you know, her idea, as I recall it from years ago, is that there's fundamentally always some other reference.
Yeah.
That there's a jump off in the camp from something else, you know. And what's the something else if it was camp in 1764?
What's the something else? I mean, patriarchy. It's the script in which, I mean, the overreach of authority, that script, you know. Or the meta-novelistic script of, you know, the peering into the recesses of your heart script. I mean, I don't know, were you thinking?
I would follow him. He's quite explicit on the topic.
Oh, say.
It's the Fielding Richardson novel.
Yeah.
He's tired of it. It doesn't have enough in it. It doesn't have fantasy in it. You know, that's what's being set up, I think, whether you call it camp or not. It's that kind of high novel that we so adore, you know, is what he's sending up. He says it right in the preface, you know.
But you make this brilliant point, John, that has been so influential to me, that the Richardsonian novel's always setting itself up. You know, like it's always self-exposed, committed to a kind of self-exposure. You know.
Yeah, which is why a lot of people don't like it.
Yeah.
Oh, I was just going to say, if on a very basic level, the camp effect of something like a drag performance has to do, or is contingent upon, the sort of indeterminacy between like essential natural states and performed states. There is a sort of tie-in to your paper, Sarah, about the way in which every time we think we have a frame, Castle of Otranto, be it a frame of affect or a frame of character, it becomes a threshold. And I think on a certain level, the text is sort of performing indeterminacies all across the board, which perhaps has a sort of affective effect, similar to sitting in a drag show, where there is a certain sort of nervous tension that has to break. You know, like you have to become comfortable with the fact that like the figure before you is in a state of performativity where they are indeterminate.
Yeah.
Text also is flowing back
Yeah.
and forth so quickly that it doesn't really know what it is.
Yeah.
The reader don't know what it is.
That seems right to me. I was thinking when you were talking, Wendy, that like in some ways I feel like I was saying, because when you were quoting Spinoza on wonder as the concept of anything when the mind comes to a stand, it's like, oh God, I was just like making the same argument over again, because I was kind of saying that the book makes the mind come to a stand, but I don't think I want to call it wonder, or that's not trying to say that just again, but it's the effect of that indeterminacy or kind of code switching, where, you know, are you experiencing this as a suspenseful novel, or are you immersed in it, or is somebody are the characters in the novel following clues, or are they just experiencing these weird dream states and hallucinations and not knowing what to do with them?
Or even as set up in Walpole's second preface, are you experiencing a romance or a realist novel?
Yeah.
And you're kind of switching back and forth.
Exactly.
Yeah, no, I was thinking more about how the prefaces have, I mean, I know I'm just like seeing shelves everywhere now, but just the fact that there are these frames, that there are these frameworks that almost overwhelm the text itself. Yeah.
And as Margaret Duty has argued, perhaps with excessive vigor, the romance was still very much in print and alive at this time. So that switching is not between a hypothetical form that's old and a new form. They're both there.
So this might not be surprising, but I guess I want to actually push back a little bit against this language of indeterminacy, or maybe to get more precise about what we're talking about when we're pointing at certain things that happen in the text. So I spent a lot of time in the last 2 weeks when I was teaching this, trying to figure out what actually comes out of the frame in that scene, because it isn't, in fact, the portrait. If by the portrait you mean the thing on the canvas, I think it's actually supposed to be the figure on the canvas, because that's the only thing that can shake its head. Okay, so I just want to say that so that we know what we're talking about. And similarly with the cheek of the the cheek of the helmet as your sort of emblem, Sarah, for this metaphor, because that's actually metonymy, right? It's the cheek. The cheek is, the helmet has the cheek only to the extent that the helmet is designed to point to the human body that it no longer contains, right? So, so those are two things, material, features of the text that I want us to hold on to. And then I wanted to point to something that intrigued me about the Foley video, which is that there's a kind of interestingly naive literalism where in order to produce the sound, they seem to feel they have to move their bodies in the same way. So the moment it really struck me was when the guy falls down on the floor in order to make the sound of falling down. Whereas presumably you could make a sound like that, and we'd all sitting in the theater be like, yeah, sure, fine, totally.
There are countless examples from literature about this. This video just happened to be the most vivid I could find, but also I had to. It's 5 minutes long, and I only had 10 minutes. I had to cut it off before the leg of lamb. There's a big fight, and they're socking this leg of lamb.
So there we have a kind of. So it's not so much. It seemed to me that we've got realism without the real. We've got the real, but detached from the
The putative.
From one referent, right? And instead,
you got two realities.
So this is all very confused, but it seemed to me that what's happening when we talk about indeterminacy and frames, and we too easily slip into saying what's moving out of the picture is, or the picture is moving out of the frame, is a kind of dematerialization, or which we do all the time. It's a metaphor for some larger thing. And then there you have, a kind of naive commitment to a materiality which would require that the sounds of the body in motion, the human body in motion, would have to be produced by that body or a version of that body, in the same kind of motion, right?
It's is a technical problem in the making of film. I mean, in theory, though all those falls and so forth, when they were shot, could have been recorded on the soundtrack with the dialogue, but it doesn't work because there's so much other noise around. And so with certain Foley things, there just has to be a literalness, the click of the latch. Now, they could go to a lot more work and click the latch some other way. And in fact, now much of that is digital anyway. I mean, the real Foley is this kind of physicality. But no, I think it's, to me...
I guess if it's a simulacrum, why is it such a kind of literal, naively literal simulacrum?
But you would, if you just had the video of the two guys and all of their stuff, you know, assuming you would assent to the idea that the chase in the film creates a certain suspense, you would not experience that watching these guys hammer on trash cans and fall over and go. And did you notice how the one guy, when running down the hall, went?
Yeah.
And so. To
represent distance.
Yes, exactly. That's right. You know, so I think your point's well taken in some ways, but I guess if it's for a longer paper, I would go more into parallel technical issues in the novel about how these effects become real. I use this blanket term about the audiovisual contract to kind of cover a lot of that. But it's, yeah.
So just thinking, so you're asking the question, why is a problem with materiality being solved with materiality? Which isn't good, yeah, or something. Is that?
I mean, I guess I just wanted to know, does it matter for us to get clear on what emerges from the frame?
Yeah.
In our accounts of what is significant about that trope or that moment or that, you know.
And it's still mimetic is partly what you're saying, isn't it? That like both in the Foley and the cheeks, that these are not just objects or artificial effects, but they're still kind of bound to the body in some way.
But
Whether it's like representationally in the figure of the portrait or like the cheeks because they're molded on the cheeks. Yeah, I think that's really true, and I just wanted to say I think you're totally right that I don't want it to flatten it out all into, well, everything's indeterminate, and at the end that seems boring and not true. But yeah, I think we need to cling to the specificity of these particular moments, and I would need to think harder about like exactly how they work in the panel and the cheek of the cask.
Part of what's coming out of the frame is Walpole with the second preface. That is, his authorship
Right.
is revealed.
Yeah.
You know, and it's. What was I going to say? Oh well.
He also apparently is thinking of a particular portrait at Strawberry Hill because he mentions that too in a letter.
Right.
He says when that happens, you should think of. I don't remember what the portrait is, so that would be interesting to know, like what specific image is.
I think, to me, though, what is being imitated here? I mean, to me, this book is like sci-fi. You know, it's using the techniques that we're familiar with from the realist novel, but what's being imitated isn't there. So, and this is part of the critique of the so-called the Fielding Richardson novel. That's not there either. You know, but he's calling attention to the not there-ness.
Right.
Of the objects being represented. You know, it's I think a brilliant treatise on mimesis, you know, which is part of what I'm trying to get at with the Foley effects. And so
just to be dumb for a second, I mean, the Richardson Fielding thing kind of is there in the sense that if you sort of strip away all the kind of medieval stuff, it's basically just a family having a row about.
That he's keeping the psychological realism of the modern novel.
Right.
He's just joining it with
the interesting plot trappings of the magical world.
His term is expanded fantasy. There's not enough fantasy in those novels.
Also, I wanted to ask you, Sophie, about the question about the status of belief as you see it sort of borne out here. It seemed to be that one of the categories that you really wanted to put some pressure on, and then it seems like Walpole is avowedly doing that in the prefaces.
Yeah.
And then in the novel, in the way he sort of sets up the novel itself, but beginning by saying there's something like the credulity of this world in the Middle Ages excuses the whole supernatural apparatus of the novel itself, and then in the second preface I sort of move away from that. So and it seems like maybe there's the status of internally to the novel, and then in some sort of contractual relationship to the reader of what we're supposed to believe transforms
Over the course of the book.
Over the course of
the publications of the book.
Exactly.
Scott takes that up in his preface and tries to treat this as an historical novel to make it work.
The reason I'm hesitating is that I am interested in something that A, I haven't fully thought through, but B, I think is a little subtle, which is, for me, the obvious move to make about the Gothic and all this kind of stuff, and fantasy and that video and everything, is to say, there's, just to be really simple about it, there's way too much empirical stuff going on. There's way too much real. There's way too much material. There's way too much stuff that's supposed to be like the thing it's imitating. So we should jump the other way, and we should reinstate belief. We should prioritize belief over knowledge. We should prioritize credulity over skepticism. Blah blah blah. And what seems uninteresting to me about that solution is that it isn't true and it doesn't work. This is sort of where I fall off the edge of the world. I don't really have that much more to say about that because I haven't thought it through. But I think that that the Gothic isn't proposing a return to the credulous or the superstitious or the immaterial or the non-real, the counter-empirical, as a sort of curative or antidote to the real. I don't think, even though it makes that gesture. It feels to me, I've never thought about camp before, so I'm very, very beginner mind about it. But it feels interesting to me in sort of the relation of belief to knowledge, or of credulity to skepticism, feels similar to me in the Gothic as the relation of camp to heterosexual matrimony. It is a solution that does all the things that you said, somehow. But I have to think more about it. But the note I would like to sound is that it isn't. I'm trying to think through and this is where all the stuff about involuntary obligation or what was the other thing I talked about? I can't remember, but anyway, that's where all that comes in, because I'm sort of trying to think through this idea of, basically I'm just trying to think through the idea that we don't have to sort of continue to chew on the kind of remnants of credulity versus skepticism and belief versus knowledge and all that stuff. And yet we're dealing with, with this, here's the archive. Right. Yeah. And actually, on that point, I would say that Coleridge is, in fact, putting his... It's not like Coleridge thinks up the willing suspension of disbelief per se, but he puts his finger, or he identifies something that seems to me... He gives it a name but it doesn't seem to me that that's the origin moment for that particular intellectual or cognitive move. That's all a bit vague. Yeah.
Where does Walpole's word fancy fit into this belief skepticism?
That's a good question. So how does he use the word fancy?
He does. It's precisely his word.
No, how?
Oh.
Can you read the quote?
Yeah, I can. Invention has not been wanting, but the great resources of fancy have been dammed up by a strict adherence to common life.
That's a really good question. I don't know. I mean, I bet I could give you a good answer to that, but I definitely can't do it right now.
Well, I mean,
do you know?
This is a moment of Methodism. It's a moment. It's a continuing battle against Catholicism.
Yeah.
In the Anglican Church.
Yeah.
I think there are a lot of phantasms of fancy out there.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess part of what I was trying to say about his dad is that he was sort of pretty invested in making fancy more safe or something by sort of limiting its impact.
Is your Hoadley the guy Hogarth painted?
Yes. Yeah.
Shall we continue the conversation informally and thank all the panelists today and this morning, this afternoon, this morning for wonderful, really wonderful.